All right, the floor is open. Marin, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't. Yeah, so if people have questions, you throw them in the chat, or else we can probably come up with some discussion points. And as Nick said, Liz DeGangi will not be here, but we could speak broadly to age estimation and her talk as well. But she is setting up her other afternoon webinar.
I don't know what the protocol is. Sorry, I'm just going to speak. I see there are 63 people in the call, which is awesome. I'm really excited. I'm not in the street, in fact, just in case some of you are inclined to believe Nick. This is what the interior of a room in the coffee region of Colombia looks like. But I want to say that I scanned through the participants. I'm so excited and depressed at the same time not to be with you all. I see so many people that I've known forever, and I'm really glad. And I hope that maybe these talks have triggered something that really ought to be bigger, because I see Tracy Rogers is there. You know, she dropped ethics early on. I did mediocre research on it that was never published 20 years ago. I mean, and you see the range of talks and how it touches on so many different aspects. We've seen through this conference and all through this year, the uproar and the very different perspectives on what is ethical relative to activism and neutrality, etc. And we aren't answering these questions adequately. It's a huge problem, and we really, I hope, can provoke and dedicate ourselves to looking at that. You know, the sociopolitical context of our science. It's so understudied and underdiscussed. I hope that we can take that further. Not necessarily all in this call.
So there's a question from Alex, which is, how do we feel about presenting in reporting / publishing case studies and the ethics around those? The individual didn't give consent, but they can also be viewed as valuable teaching, learning tools. And I mean, I guess we'll open this up to Marin, Derek, and Erica. Erica already replied in the chat also. But I mean, if anybody else has anything too, I mean, you can unmute and join in. It'll be kind of a fun conversation for us to try to have.
I mean, I'll say quickly. So we also, this was in, we touched on this a little bit in the book that Nick and I wrote together, that, and somebody else, Derek said it, that it depends on the context. So there's like context and consent. And if you can't get informed consent in advance to publish the study, I mean, you also need to think of the legalities of publishing it beyond like whether you can publish the study itself, but has the case been adjudicated? Will you publishing on a case study be problematic in any way? But also a big part of it too is, I think as long as it's like anonymized and there's value and it's not just to sensationalize, then those are all good questions to ask. There's a big debate going on too about the publishing of photos of skeletal remains too, which is like really going, in bioarchaeology, they're talking about a lot more. So that's also something to think about. Maybe you publish the case study, but if you don't publish the photos, how valuable is it? And, you know, even if the person, you know, doesn't know, their family might see it, or other stakeholders could see the remains. So these are all questions you have to ask. I think there's no blanket answer for it. It's just like broad, you just need to think broadly about the issue and who could be affected.
Hi, I'm Jesse. So my work, well, my preliminary work right now is with is indigenous remains. So when I think it was Erica that brought up the as long as it's anonymous, for me that that issue of anonymity doesn't mean that it doesn't have to go through ethical review. Like working with indigenous remains, I have to get permission from local council, like tribe and council members, to do any kind of publishing or reveal any of that type of research. I have to make sure that the way that I'm presenting it, or the the way that I'm talking about it is respectful. So it really is dependent on like who this is going to affect and who you're doing your research for, because oftentimes your research outcome is really affects the ethics of what you can do. Adding my bit.
Thanks, Jesse. I think that's a great point. I saw that Derek had a story he wanted to tell in the chat.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks for your comment. And that's exactly why I said it's context dependent, because I worked in BC for a bit and there was a house fire in an Indigenous community. 8 people died. And so some of us responded to that. But before we went into kind of the traditional territory and the current territory of this Indigenous group, the coroner told us, let's go to the police station first. Okay, great. And there we met with elders of the community and lawyers, in fact. And the coroner explained to us, look, this is how it's going to play out. We have a legal mandate and responsibility to respond, but here things work a bit differently. And we're going to ask them for permission to enter into their territory. And they'll probably grant it to us, but that's a procedure that the police have decided is necessary to ensure that there's sort of a mutual respect, right? It's not just one authority imposing itself on another. And I cited that example. I was giving testimony in a case at the International Criminal Court, and the defense was kind of critiquing that family members were present during exhumations. This was in Central Africa. And I cited that example. And he, in fact, the defendant or the counsel for the defense said, well, you certainly wouldn't let this sort of thing happening. This certainly wouldn't happen in Canada, would it? And I mean, he walked right into it. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, yes, it does happen in Canada, right? And it just goes to this point, the legal, I mean, there's legal, but Rosa Parks, Pierre Guillaume, and I published on that in a forensic anthropology textbook. Rosa Parks, right? Everything that happened with her was legal, but it wasn't right. And in particular with the Indigenous community, I mean, that's something that has to be negotiated, right? What is right?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. I think that's great. I see in the chat there's some kind of discussion about the identifiability of even kind of anonymized case studies and the ethical considerations around that. And I think that kind of leads us to this idea that there really isn't an easy answer for how and when to decide when to publish that type of thing. I mean, Marin and I are both big believers in that context and consent idea, but I also think that there's a precedent in some of the museum studies and some of the more medical literature for, you know, how much good is it going to do versus how much harm could it cause, and trying to weigh that without, of course, knowing, you know, because you're just kind of doing your best without having any idea of the potential harm. But it's not an easily addressed question. And I also see that Erica brought up ethical approval, which I don't know how, you know, you talked about it a little bit in your talk, Erica, but I think it's a very different system in South Africa than the United States in terms of like IRB and how all that stuff might be really addressed.
Yeah, I think South Africa looks at it more closely. Basically what I said, because of our past historical circumstances, there were so many people from Europe coming and taking human individuals out of South Africa, not to mention the previous apartheid government. So everything we do with human remains has to go through a research ethics committee. And that's just the way it is. When we started this repository, if anyone wants to use the repository, they have to use the research ethics committee at the University of Pretoria and prove that they have ethics from their institution, wherever that may be. That's just the way South Africa works. I'm not sure about the United States, but I remember back in the day when I was a student and I did research, I didn't have to apply for ethical approval to use any skeletal remains.
Yeah, I mean, I believe typically skeletal remains are not considered human subjects throughout the United States, so you're usually exempt from IRB for that reason. There's a bunch of stuff going on in the chat. It's hard for me to keep up. So Kate Lashoto asks, I'm curious about how the consent process works with whole body donation programs, and whether donors give broad consent to all types of research or whether explicit consent is needed to subject the donor to trauma studies. I'll just say, I think it's really institutional dependent. So here at Western, we have a willed body program, and in our willed body forms, there's like a checkbox basically that says, you know, what the donor will consent and not consent to in terms of trauma studies and taphonomic studies and that type of thing. I'm not sure how it works in South Africa, or if anybody else here wants to chime in on how it works for them.
Basically, in South Africa, broad consent means that we can do anything with your body into perpetuity. And that basically relies on advancement in technology. So I can micro CT scan your skull, and I can use it in digital research, and I can share it with others. I can collaborate with others. But we would never be allowed to set that body on fire, nor are we allowed to do trauma research on it. So there is a stopping point where our university would say, no, sorry, this is unethical. Because we would have to demonstrate how that research or what we were doing, if we said we wanted to study how a body reacts to necklacing, and necklacing is a form of, I guess, judicial violence in South Africa, when you put tires over your head, pour some gasoline and light the person on fire. It's very common in the 1980s, and we still see it today. We don't know a lot about what the body does in that situation. We've seen a few cases, but it's, what would the word be? Not scientific, it's more, I'll think of the word in a minute. But if I went to my ethics board and I asked them, I would like to burn these 10 bodies, I will put tires over them and light them on fire with gasoline, and would like to see what happened to the remains, we would have to have a very strong case for how what we are doing is going to benefit society as a whole. And that's what the real outcome is. If we want to do the research, we have to see how we're going to benefit living South Africans. And that may be because I'm in a medical school. It may be different somewhere else if you're not associated with a medical school. So it could be South Africa, or it could be where I am situated in the university system.
I'll just add to that. I know that back when I was at Michigan State, we were doing some research, and we were trying to decide what IRB we needed to complete for it. And it became clear that medical examiner records don't count as medical records. And so they're not subject to HIPAA and all that type of stuff. And so it's a completely kind of different system and a lot of loopholes in terms of what you can find from medical examiner records and use for research versus medical records. It's really kind of strange how all that stuff kind of gets worked out.
Sarah, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, sorry. I was typing a question in the chat, and I found that I can't actually read the chat and listen at the same time. So I decided just to jump in and ask. I'm kind of curious as to what procedures, I guess, if any, people use for requesting permission to use cases for professional training versus in class versus research. And I found I put a question like that on our feedback survey after we submitted reports for cases, and it really differed by state. When I was in Idaho in particular, not to call them out, but they basically said our population is so small, we have so few cases that no matter how you present it or how you try to anonymize it, we're not comfortable with you presenting information because you're going to encounter family and friends. And even for training purposes, we don't think it's appropriate. But I would imagine if people just don't ask, then it would be really valuable also, but it's a huge ethical consideration. So I was just wondering how people have addressed that.
Thanks, Sarah. That's interesting. Anybody have anything in particular? Any thoughts? I know for me, you know, when I would do like a case study for a class or something that I'm teaching, I try to keep it as anonymized as possible. And if I share my slides with the students or the class, I pull the images out. And I pull out, you know, the intro context slide or something. So I just really try to hit whatever the kind of takeaways, like the learning objectives from the case study was. I don't know what other people do or how if they have any thoughts on that. Interesting. Thanks, Erica. Erica posted in the chat there.
Yeah, I can't type and write. I'm sorry, I'm not that smart.
Alex says she does the same for teaching, images and details removed when posting online for students. Emily asked, I'm curious about panelist opinions after thoughtfully and thought-provoking problematizing ancestry and sex, whether anyone is currently leaning towards not estimating reporting ancestry in forensic anthropology casework. I mean, we could try to talk about that a little bit here. I think it's kind of out of the scope of what we're trying to talk about in this panel, and maybe we'll be better in the afternoon session thing that Teresa and Liz and everybody organized. But if anybody wants to comment on it, I'd say go for it. I'm also trying to keep up with the chat here. Thanks, Emily. It is dead quiet though. Anybody else have anything to add?
I'll comment on Sarah's text here where she was saying that she's curious whether we need explicit permission to present. And I don't know how you get that. I mean, because then if you go to next of kin, that could also be re-traumatizing them as well. So there's a lot of questions there. If I'm ever going to do a case study or use a photo from any casework too, I also check with the medical examiner's office just to make sure that it's okay with them and that the case has been finalized. But yeah, the use of photos in research and teaching is again none of these are easy answers or blanket statements.
Yeah, I'll just add that I don't really understand how they go about doing it, but you know, in the clinical literature, they publish case studies all the time with very, very identifying information. And I don't really know what process, if any, they go through to get permission. I've seen before where people will say, you know, this was me. I didn't know they were going to publish this study about my, you know, experience with this illness or whatever. So it's kind of strange.
Can I jump in here without my
Yeah.
camera? It's Alex Clails. So I guess the reason, part of why I asked it too is I do most of the casework in Kansas and Missouri, and there is so much of it that we are turning down cases. And so the students help with the casework. They help with maceration. They help with the photography. They're never by themselves. I'm always with them supervising. And we put them through ethics training. They sign a legal disclaimer for that. But I still, you know, the medical examiner, the investigating agencies know and approve beforehand that students are working on it. But I wonder what like families think about that. Am I, you know, would they not be okay with that? But then that would greatly hinder my ability to do cases. We're already turning down cases because there's too many. And if I didn't have the students helping with it, it'd be even fewer. So I wonder about like sort of students and how important it is to get experience with casework to be a forensic anthropologist and the training involved, but the lack of consent by the individuals involved in those cases or their family even on having students work on them.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess maybe to kind of turn your comment into more of a question there, I think you're kind of talking about the ethicality of having students work on casework and assist with casework. And I know that there was that survey that Miranda and I did a couple of years ago where we asked people, you know, what makes you qualified to be a forensic anthropologist? And I think experience was the number one or number two thing that people said. But, you know, there isn't any official training, experiential activities within forensic anthropology, as we all know. It's not like you're going to do a postdoc or anything, or a whatever the word is that I can't think of that doctors do. But, you know, if you're not going to let students do casework, how are they going to get that experience? And it's residency. Yes, thank you, Derek. Always smarter than me. So, you know, it does bring up an interesting question as to what do we do about that? And I know that, you know, some people, I think Dennis Dirkmatt, for example, would, you know, he often tells the you know, if they're called to do a recovery, right? I think he tells the police, hey, we'll do it, but we're going to bring students along. And if you don't want us to do that, then we're not going to come assist. And, you know, I'm sure there's some ethical questions involved in that kind of practice too. I don't know. I see there's stuff going on in the chat I'm going to try to catch up on, but anybody else jump on in.
So the issue of photographs came up when I was studying in the UK. And there they had I believe it was a specific legislation about digital media use, which I don't think, at least I don't think Canada has, where they could use it for like their personal documentation, but they couldn't distribute it in any way. So when their slides were published online through their like online learning apparatus, they had to remove all of those images, and they could only use it when it was like reading directly from their personal computer. And they had personal responsibility for those images, so that if they did show up somewhere online or something like that, like they were directly responsible for any issues that came from that. But as far as I know, that type of media sharing, it falls under different different legal standpoints. I don't think it's necessarily an ethical issue as much as who owns that type of media. And I just don't think, I don't know about the States, but I know Canada hasn't arrived to that point yet of who owns that type of digital media and what can you do with it.
Thanks, Jesse. I think those are great points. I saw Tracy Rogers had her hand up for a second. I don't know if that was a misclick or if she had something she wanted to add.
I was just going to comment on the use of students in casework. This is a common practice for me, but there's also levels of introducing students to different kinds of cases, and the level of preparation that the students themselves have. So typically my students cannot come to work on a case with me until after they've undergone the forensic anthropology field school, they've undergone osteology, they've are at least probably taking the undergraduate forensic anthropology course. So that gives them the opportunity to gain some experience, but they already have some practice in a controlled setting of the classroom. I always make it clear to the coroner, to the police, that I plan to bring in students. Is this an issue? We discuss it and kind of go from there. So it's a fairly common practice, but it's a structured common practice, I'd say.
That's great, thanks. I know that Alex does something similar where I think that there's some criteria maybe that students have to there's some type of threshold they have to do. Yeah, she's posted in the chat. I don't know how common that is for other programs in terms of, you know, maybe they've had to take osteology or get a B+ or better or whatever to do casework. I don't know. Erica, you're nodding. Do you have something to add?
Yeah, our students are slightly different because they come from medical sciences. So they've done anatomy, osteology, histology, genetics, and I think physiology. And they do everything else. They do the biohazard training, the safety training, and they're all postgraduates. So we don't take undergraduates, and they're just postgraduate students doing their honors year, which is, I believe Canada has the same system as we do, but the US, we do 4 years undergrad and then we go into masters. So it's just a little different.
Interesting. I see that there's some stuff in the chat about applying for the ABFA and mock cases versus real cases. I think that that's, you know, a very circular argument. I'm a big believer that you probably shouldn't be doing casework, sole authoring reports unless you're certified, but you know, how do you show that you know what you're doing without that ability? And it's really circular. And I think that the fact that they're allowing mock cases now is really good. And, you know, hopefully the ABFA will get to a even better system for kind of evaluating that. That's my opinion. I'm not speaking as, you know, the vice president of the ABFA, just to clarify. That's just Nikki P. But I totally hear people and understand that it's frustrating when we say you need experience, but it can be hard to get experience, especially if you're attending a program that doesn't get to do a lot of forensic anthropology consulting or anything like that. You know, there's some programs get a lot and some don't get as much.
I do think that this concept of gatekeeping that's coming up too is interesting to discuss, because not only do you need to have access to casework and the appropriate training, but to even apply to sit for the exam, you have to have diplomates write you letters. So you need to even just know diplomates generally, and they have to be from, you know, 2 different institutions, right, Nick? It can't just be like the same. I think it has to be from 2 different institutions.
Not on that committee.
And there's a lot of money. I have a lot of students ask me about these short courses and getting access as a means to get, you know, they're paying money to try to get into grad school, to get to these classes, to get access to different scholars. And that's all kind of some gatekeeping that's there too. I agree that there need to be standards for training and qualifications to do this work, but we need to think about how somebody can get there.
Yeah, I'll just dovetail what Miranda's kind of saying. I mean, I'm a big believer in minimum standards for practice, but I don't care what they necessarily are. And I think that there's lots of different ways that we can get people the qualifications that they need to practice. I mean, there's an upcoming workshop, I think on the 13th of March, Natalie was here earlier anyway, that the ABFA is hosting, just kind of discussing the potential to do accreditations for forensic anthropology programs. Natalie, you're welcome to jump in and plug it if you want. But I think that the potential to have accredited programs that provide education in forensic anthropology, depending on what that accreditation looks like, could solve some of these issues in terms of making sure people are meeting competencies and having some type of experience and leaving a program knowing how to write a mock case report, even if it's just a mock report. I don't know. Natalie, you're welcome to join in if you want, but also feel free to not, no pressure.
No, you did a nice summary. Thanks.
Yeah, but that's free, a free workshop that's up. So, you know, if you need more information on it, email Natalie or I, we can send you the information to register for that.
Should we let people have their lunch break?
Probably. How about any last burning question that someone really wants to ask? I appreciate everybody's commenting in the chat here. Thanks, Devora. Thanks for sharing your email there, Natalie. Okay. That's it then. Thanks for everybody for participating, especially Derek and Erica, who, you know, weren't told about this or prepared in any way to participate. And thanks y'all for attending. And I hope you're having an okay conference this week, as awkward as it is, and that everybody's doing great. All right.
Yes, thank you all.
Thanks.
We're sitting in 100 Fahrenheit here in South Africa, so no snow for us.
Yuck.
What time is it for you, Erica?